Okay, hello everyone. Thanks very much for joining our webinar today on the adoption of shared mobility in California and its impact on the use of other travel modes. My name is Mike Centetos. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I'll be moderating the webinar today. This is part of a monthly webinar series sponsored by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. NCST is part of the University Transportation Centers program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's a consortium of 6 universities around the country focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. You can sign up for our mailing list at ncst.ucdavis.edu to get notifications about upcoming webinars. We've got a couple other on the docket already. Today's webinar is going to last an hour and a half. We'll have a presentation from Giovanni Circella, and then we'll invite our guest respondent, Bruce Griesenbeck from Sacramento Area Council of Governments, to provide a guest commentary for us, and then we'll open up the floor for question and answers. So we'll try to save 20 to 30 minutes for that. We've got a question and answer feature on the Zoom webinar platform. So if you hover your mouse kind of over the bottom of your screen, you should see that, and feel free to type in your question at any time. We will be recording the webinar, and it'll be available with closed captioning on our website shortly afterwards. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Giovanni Circella. He's the director of the PreRevolution's Future Mobility Program at UC Davis, and he's also a Honda Distinguished Scholar for New Mobility Studies. So Giovanni, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mike. I hope everybody can hear me, and good morning and good afternoon for those connected from other parts of the country or the world. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about some of the results from our research we are developing here at UC Davis in cooperation with a number of researchers based here in the University of California, Davis, in other University of California campuses, and also in other universities in the country and also abroad. The focus today is going to be on shared mobility and the way the adoption of shared mobility is changing travel patterns, in particular in California. Most of the findings I will have is from this state, but also in other parts of the country, and how this is changing also the use of other modes in transportation. And the motivation for this study is really being that even if in the United States we live in a pretty car-dependent society, things have been changing quite a bit during the last few years. Already several years have passed since the first car-sharing programs were launched in the United States. And in the last few years, a lot of new services have really populated the transportation world, with on-demand mobility services that are now accessible from our smartphone, and also with new options that get added to our urban mobility systems every year. And so the latest change that we have had in the last couple of years in American cities is really associated with the micro-mobility options that we are seeing in a lot of places now. And in the future, things will change further. The more we will have increased automation in transportation and the combination of automation with shared options and so on, we will have increased ability to conduct other activities while traveling, but also we will have the possibility to change our relationship with using a private vehicle versus using other modes of transportation and so on. So this motivation is really something that is moving a lot of our activities here at UC Davis. And I want to acknowledge all the partners that work with us in research in the PreRevolution Future Mobility Program at the University of California, Davis. This program is really a program that focuses on the changes brought by what we call the 3 revolutions: shared mobility, electrification, and vehicle automation, and how they are really changing the transportation world. And we want to provide a strong research that supports policy analysis and also well-informed investment and government decision in this area. And for those of you that are not familiar with this book yet, I would recommend that you check the book 3 Revolutions from our ITS director, Dan Sperling at UC Davis. It's a very interesting book that was published in 2018 that a little bit kind of dive into the future that would be associated with these 3 revolutions in transportation. And we are particularly interested in this because many times we really get asked how things will evolve in the future. And certainly many of you in the audience have been faced before with the dichotomy of the future that could look either as something that is wonderful and perfect, the heaven of transportation, or something that could go in a very different direction if things go wrong. And certainly, like, we can imagine a future that could be potentially harvesting the benefits from shared mobility, electrification, automation. In this future, cars will be all electric. We will have an energy mix which is clean. This is certainly something we expect to happen in California. We will have increased capacity of transportation, better livability in cities, integration with public transportation, and everybody will pretty much benefit also from sharing intelligent vehicles and traveling in a more sustainable way. Things could go also wrong. We could have increased congestion associated with increased travel demand. We could have electricity eventually produced with coal or dirty energy mixes. We could have even more car dependence in our society, and eventually a reduced role of transit in our cities with ghost vehicles or empty vehicles. So there will be automated shuttles that will going around in cities in the future, and even less livability in our cities. Where the future will be? Well, more likely will be somewhere in between. But the policies we'll develop today are really going to steer the future towards something that is closer to the heaven scenario or closer to the hell scenario eventually. And before diving into our research, I really want to start with a quote that comes actually from somebody who is not here at UC Davis. It's actually somebody from the auto industry that mentioned that in the future, the way they see it, people won't have as many vehicles because they'll share one and own only one. And this is really pretty different from the society we are today with a lot of car dependence in our society, at least in the United States. And this quote actually comes from somebody working in the auto industry, the Ford CEO, and gives really like a sense of how things are changing quite a bit in the transportation industry, and also what the expectations for the future are, and how many players are getting ready also for a future that is changing in this direction. In our program in UC Davis, we are particularly interested in understanding how these transportation revolutions are affecting vehicle ownership and travel behaviors. During the last few years, we have seen several changes in the way new services are adopted. I borrowed this slide from our colleague Regina Clilo that shows really how new shared mobility services have been adopted during the past few years, and how older services like car sharing or traditional bike sharing has had like rather slow penetration in society, but how in the last few years, in only 7 years, ride-hailing has grown so much and very quickly. And now that we have pretty much, these are data from 2018, so e-scooters at the time were very, very young, but they're growing very quickly. And just to corroborate some of these findings, we can see that car sharing, after some years of growth in ridership in the previous years, is kind of a little bit plateauing, with a plateau in the demand and the number of users in the United States. It has had a presence in cities, but it's not growing as much as probably somebody anticipated in the past. Certainly more important is the growth in terms, at least in terms of trends, in the growth of what we call TNCs, transportation network companies. In the US market, Uber and Lyft, Didi and Ola are the big players at international level in other countries. And we can see how in only a few years, these companies have really generated a high ridership, which is getting close to the one from public transportation services, which is kind of amazing if we think that it took many decades to develop public transportation systems, and these new app-based services now in just a few years are developing a volume of ridership which is getting close in terms of order of magnitude to the one of transit. In the latest revolution in cities with micromobility. Micromobility, which is adding with the dockless scooters and bike sharing system, a lot of new bikes and new scooters in cities, but also increasing substantially the ridership and the use of these services. The number of micromobility services in the US is growing quickly. This is a map actually from NACTO already from 2018. I would say that many more systems have been deployed in the meantime in the last 12 months. So it's pretty impressive how things have changed. And so in our studies, in our research here, we're really trying to understand how the adoption of these new services are changing travel behavior, and potentially in the future, what impact this will have also on vehicle ownership and the future of our cities. So I also, to put things in perspective, I want to say that we said that things are growing very quickly, but at the same time, we need to also think that absolute numbers are still talking about a minority of users using these services. For instance, if we look in 2017 and HTS data, the National Household Travel Survey, the last round of this data available for the United States, we can see that pretty much only 10% of American residents that participated in the study, they reported that they use ride-hailing in the past 30 days. And also, if we look at where these users are located, pretty much they are located in the 5 most populous states predominantly, and in particular, like, in big cities and metro regions in these areas. Still, even if we have not that many trips that are made by ride-hailing, the current mode share for ride-hailing is below 1%, so we're still talking about a pretty small percentage of trips in the United States are made by ride-hailing. Still, if you look at the location where these trips happen, a lot of ride-hailing trips are actually made among origin and destinations, which are in the central core cities or in the neighborhoods which are kind of close to downtown districts. And this means also that in terms of their expected impacts on traffic and the potential use of other modes, their impacts are actually bigger than what the small percentage in terms of mode share would suggest. And this is very different from the distribution of car trips that many times in the United States happen among neighborhoods which are farther away from downtown, and also in places where the road network is more developed towards the use of cars and private vehicles. So in our research program here, we are paying quite a bit of attention to these topics, and they were doing this for a few different studies. I will mainly talk today about one of our flagship projects, which is our California panel study of emerging transportation trends. This is a longitudinal study we started already in 2015, and it's a longitudinal study with a rotating panel approach. So basically, we follow respondents over time, refreshing the panel, adding new members at each round of data collection, having an increase also in the sample size over time. We started in 2015 with a study that mainly focused on millennials and members of the so-called Generation X. So pretty much we cover every adult that was between 18 and 50 in 2015. But then starting in 2018, we decided to widen and broaden the topic of the project to all age groups in California as our population of interest. We have a quota sampling system in which we recruited respondents by geographic region of California and neighbor type, and trying to have also like a sample that was more mirroring as much as possible the distribution by social demographics in California. And we developed a set of ways to correct for non-representativeness of the sample. And the focus of this study was really about changing lifestyles, adoption of shared mobility and new mobility services, but also about the attitudes towards the use of partially automated vehicles and fully automated vehicles in the future in the state. So a little bit of information about the timeline of the project. As I mentioned, we started in 2015 with a smaller sample of 2,400 respondents, and this was members of the Generation X and millennials contacted for an opinion panel. We expanded in 2018 the study with not only resampling as many as possible of the respondents from 2015, but also expanding the data collection to all adults 18 plus in 2018, and also having a combination of paper, online surveys, a random sampling of the California population, a mailing invitation to California households at their mailing address, and also using online opinion panels. And now we also do all our surveys in English and Spanish, because there is a big population in California of people of Hispanic origin, and we wanted to make sure that we increase the likelihood that these participants are part of this study, and also their ease of participating in the study. We will plan to continue this study with a similar method in future years, but also starting this year, we also started to have annual updates, because we recognize that doing a data collection every 3 years is very useful to monitor big changes in the household decision to buy a vehicle or to get rid of a vehicle, changes happening in the household characteristics with somebody moving out of the household, or somebody that have a child, or they start a new job, or they leave college to start their profession and so on. But at the same time, a lot of things are happening on every year pretty much. And so if you want also to track the big changes happening in transportation, having annual updates of this data that is very important with annual data collection that we are now carrying on. Some of the main findings in terms of the changes in the use of shared mobility from our study. In the last 3 years, we have seen really that some types of shared mobility services have become much more popular. Car sharing is really being little change in terms of the use of it in the last few years. It's more or less stable or even slightly declining in these areas because it's not really booming as much as it was in the past, and it's really remaining a niche phenomenon among some users. What we see is certainly a sharp increase in the use of ride-hailing services. So services like those provided by Uber and Lyft in California. And also in the past few years, we have had the introduction of shared ride-hailing services with a pooled option, Uber Pool and Lyft Share, which are now a common presence in big cities and are increasingly adopted, especially by certain segments of the population. And then the latest thing is the appearance of micromobility with dockless bike sharing and e-scooter sharing, which are actually changing also the way people travel in urban areas, and we will talk about this towards the end of this presentation. So just to give you some information about the frequency with which users in our sample use shared mobility services. This slide focuses in particular on ride-hailing and shared ride-hailing in a few seconds. And I want to mention that for all slides where I provide numbers and information, I always try to have towards the bottom of the screen the information about the references where you can find more information about this study. So if you have any interest in getting all the details about the research, please check the information at the bottom of the screen where you can find links to reports in this case, and in future slides to journal papers and other scientific publications we have produced from this study. So as we can see, moving from 2015 to 2018, there's been a general increase in the adoption of ride-hailing, with more users that move towards more frequent categories of use of this service. And also in 2018, there's been the presence of shared ride-hailing that started to appear, at least in big cities in California. How different users across different social demographics use these services?
Mike, could you quickly clarify the difference between ride-hailing and shared ride-hailing? What do you mean?
Oh, absolutely. It seems like some people have just joined the webinar. Happy to give any clarification, and please provide comments in writing, and Mike will monitor them during the webinar. The ride-hailing service here in this study, we follow the general classifications that are now becoming a standard in the field. So by ride-hailing, I refer to the so-called single-user classic ride-hailing service. So it's the typical service that is available in most cities, provided by TNCs, transportation network companies. So it's pretty much what is called UberX, or what Lyft has called for many years as Lyft Classic. It's basically the single-user type of ride-hailing service. I say single-user, meaning that one user with the app will call the ride. Of course, there could be multiple passengers if the user is calling a ride for an entire household or family or for a group of friends, but there is one paying user that has booked the trip through the app. When we talk about shared ride-hailing or pool ride-hailing, is also another expression that is used in the industry. We are referring to services like Uber Pool and Lyft Share that allow the possibility to match multiple users that will book independently on different smartphones, on different apps. They will book a ride, and when they have a destination which is somehow going in the same direction and somehow parts of the trip could be done in common, the provider of the service will match the riders so that there will be higher occupancy in this vehicle at the cost of a little bit longer travel time and some detours to pick up the additional passengers. So this is usually a low-cost option the users can choose to reduce the cost of traveling with these services, and the other hand, they somehow pay for these services by having more time to spend in the car and also waiting more for the vehicle to pick them up. So when we look at the changes in the use of ride-hailing, we have started to look at this topic from different angles. This slide summarizes a couple of different focuses. One is about the increase in the use of ride-hailing when we moved from 2015 to 2018 in different households when we group them by their vehicle ownership category. And we can see that pretty much between 2015 and 2018, there's been an increase in the frequency with which people use ride-hailing across all households. It's interesting to see that this is across households that have zero vehicles. They don't own any vehicle in their household. We define a low vehicle owning household as those households that have fewer vehicles than drivers. So So there is somehow some competition for the use of vehicles inside a household. And we define high vehicle owning households as those households that have at least one vehicle per driver. Not surprisingly, the number of people that use ride-hailing very frequently, so it's the yellow part at the top of the columns, is actually lower among people that have a higher number of vehicles in the household. And of course, this is just a cross-sectional analysis with just simple cross-tabs. So we're not claiming any causality between vehicle ownership or ride-hailing, but just we are observing that the distribution of this data in the different type of households, which means there could be many reasons for which people use ride-hailing with that frequency. And of course, we can expect that people with more vehicle in the household probably are better off driving their own vehicle, and so they don't need to use ride-hailing very often. When we look into the distribution by income, we can see that moving from 2015 to 2018, there's been a pretty consistent increase in the percentage of users that use ride-hailing across all income categories. Usually people that are medium or high income tend to be more likely to use ride-hailing, but the increase is actually interesting because it's really being observed across all different income groups. And so pretty much all of them in the last 3 years, they have increased the use of ride-hailing. We collect in our data set a lot of information about also their last trips that people did and whether this was a trip done on ride-hailing and share ride-hailing. And it's very interesting to see that the distribution of users of these services who are predominantly younger users and so on, they tend to be different also when we look about people that report information about share ride-hailing versus ride-hailing. With a higher proportion of younger individuals that are likely to use share ride-hailing and report information about share ride-hailing in our data set, and older individuals that are more likely to report information about ride-hailing. Also, when we look at gender distribution, this is actually a very interesting aspect of our data collection. We see the women tend to be more often those that are reporting that they've used share ride-hailing for the last trip they made. Now, of course, sampling in this could be behind this slide. This is only a simple descriptive statistic analysis of this distribution between male and female. In our sample, we tend to have a higher percentage of female which are lower income. And so some of this distribution between the fact that more women report using share ride-hailing may be due to price sensitivity. And further analysis of this data set will dive more into this information. We collect in our study also a lot of information about the time of day when these trips are made and the level of occupancy. And I think this is very interesting because information about occupancy in the vehicle is not really something that is easily accessible. Even TNCs, they know if multiple users booked a ride when we're using share ride-hailing, but they don't really know if a single user that booked a ride is traveling by themselves or if they have one or more passengers, friends or members of the household or co-workers traveling with them. So this data that somehow is also allows us to get a better picture of how many people are traveling into this trip. And occupancy in general is not very high. It's interesting to see that even for share ride-hailing, in many areas when users actually booked a share ride-hailing ride, there is a substantial probability that the trip might be made alone, actually, because we don't get matched to other users. Certainly, share ride-hailing tends to increase the average occupancy, in particular during the weekday. During weekend nights in particular, occupancy goes up already, even for ride-hailing services. So many times, trips that are made for social purposes during the weekend are more likely to be happening already with groups of people that travel together. And so even ride-hailing tends to have a much higher occupancy during the weekend nights. What we have been focusing a lot in our study is really to understand, now that we have this pretty powerful data set, what are the different behaviors of different groups that they use ride-hailing for different purposes and how their characteristics affect the likelihood of using the services. One of these type of analysis, we developed it using a latent class adoption model in which we wanted to really look at differences between different groups of ride-hailing users. And we could identify 3 pretty well-defined type of individuals in our sample. The first one is actually the typical stereotypical type of user ride-hailing services. These are predominantly young individuals that are higher educated. In most cases, they live by themselves already or with friends, or they live with their partner, but they have left already their family of origin and live in more urban areas. And these individuals are more likely, to use these services, are by far the most frequent users of these services, and they live more in urban locations. The second group of individuals is actually very interesting because even if they use ride-hailing to a lower extent than the first group, they actually are much more affluent individuals, and many times they use ride-hailing for longer trips, and they are also less cost sensitive. So they actually are on average paying more for these trips. And this includes also a lot of people that live with their family in even suburban neighborhoods, and many times they use ride-hailing, for instance, to travel to airports or to other major terminals for their trips. The third group of individuals are actually those that are the lowest likelihood of using ride-hailing services. This includes a lot of individuals that live in lower density areas, people that are least affluent or also less educated. And for them, the likelihood of using ride-hailing on average is much lower. So we also focus in our study on what are the impacts that the use of ride-hailing among all these different segments of the population has on the use of other modes. And we did this in a number of different ways. I want to present first an analysis that we did, identified three major groups. It's kind of similar, resembles a little bit to what we saw before, but the classes are different, so please don't get confused with the three classes I presented before, in which we really classified the type of users in terms of the impact that ride-hailing has on the use of other modes. And I will start discussing these findings, so really focusing on the third class. And the reason I'm focusing on this third class is because even if this class right now is the smallest one, only 10% of the users in our sample fit in this class, is really the one that we would like to see growing in the future. Because from a point of view of planning and urban mobility, and also if we think about sustainability and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the third group of what we call transit and TNCs, so users that increase the use of transit thanks to the use of ride-hailing, is really something that we would like to see growing more. As I was saying, this is a class which is very small. It's only 10%, about 10% of the users in our sample. If we look at the fact that these users are usually low-frequency users of ride-hailing, in terms of rides, this is even less than 10%. It probably accounts for about 3 or 4% of rides by TNCs. But for these users, actually, ride-hailing already in the current situations is having kind of a positive effect on the use of transit because they use TNCs as a way to access, for instance, public transportation stations which are not in walking distance from their home, or also as a way to get home for a trip that they do by transit earlier during the day. They can return home in the evening thanks to ride-hailing services. And the other end of the spectrum, we have urban travelers. This is by far the largest group, and this includes the main users, which are urban dwellers, people that live in more central parts of the cities. They are most frequent users of Uber and Lyft. So even if about 50% of the users in our sample fit in this class, in terms of rides, there is an even larger proportion of rides that fit in this category. And the effects in this area are kind of mixed because somehow users that fit in this category tend to decrease the amount of drive they do, so because they substitute the use of a private vehicle with using ride-hailing, or they decrease the amount of walking and bicycling for their mobility needs. Also, they decrease the use of transit. The second group is really a pretty clear latent class category. It's difficult to find such clear-cut results in latent class analysis because really in this group, these are users that are pretty much replacing car trips with the use of Uber. In this slide, we're actually merging together car trips, but also trips that are made not by private vehicles, but also taxis, for instance. And this is like, for instance, the typical users in this area, in this category, tend to be higher income. They tend to be more often suburban dwellers. They tend to be car-oriented, living in car-oriented neighborhoods with poor transit access. And many times they travel towards airports and they simply substitute the use of their own car or the use of a taxi with the use of Uber and Lyft. In the reference below, you can find more details if you're interested in this analysis. We don't have the time to dive more into this in this presentation today for reasons of time, but also would welcome any follow-up questions towards the end, or we can continue the conversation. Please feel free to contact us if you have more questions and requests for information about this analysis. I also want to mention that, as we say in the title of this slide, not all demand mobility services are created equal. And really, there is a big difference if we look in terms of ride-hailing services and share ride-hailing services in terms of the impact on the use of other modes. So in the 2018 data, we have data referred to both type of systems, services. And so we really look into simply asking in this question, what user would have done if ride-hailing was not available? And so we wanted to get a sense of the differences in the potential substitution effect of ride-hailing versus shared ride-hailing. And it's interesting to see, but also somehow expected, that ride-hailing services, which on average are more expensive, but also they provide more certain travel time, are more likely to go in competition with either driving alone or even with the use of taxis. This is the typical example for trips to airports. According to information from the IPO of Uber, about 15% of their trips either are to or from the airport. So it's a pretty large percentage of their trips. And the substitution with taxis is evident in those type of trips. But this has happened more often for ride-hailing services, which are the ones that provide more certain travel time. When we look at shared ride-hailing services like Uber Pool and Lyft Share, it's interesting to see that the replacement of trips made by taxi goes down quite a bit. And we have a much higher percentage of trips that, if the shared ride-hailing services were not available, would have been made by either public bus or light rail or even walking or bicycling. So somehow, we have this unpleasant effect in which we would like to promote, ideally, more pooling and more passengers in the vehicle. So we would think the shared ride-hailing is actually a good thing, but also at the same time, we see the shared ride-hailing more likely to go in competition with the use of public transportation and walking and bicycling. And this is, of course, under the current planning and policy environment, because in the future, if new policies were developed, for instance, to encourage transfer between public transportation and ride-hailing, things could change a lot. But right now, in the current environment, this is what we find. We dive a little bit more to see who are particularly the users that do this type of substitution and this type of effect or ride-hailing on the other modes. And for instance, we see that on average, higher median income and people that have more vehicles in the household, and they use ride-hailing for longer trips, many times for shopping or social purposes, they tend to replace, more likely to replace the use of their private vehicle with the use of ride-hailing services. When we look into the second group, for instance, in particular, we focus on the reduction in the use of public transportation to switch to ride-hailing services. This happens more among students and workers, individuals that in general are more multimodal, so users of public transit and active modes, and it's typically an effect that happens for trips during the daytime. If you look at walking and bicycling, trips that are substituting for walking and bicycling because of the use of Uber and Lyft, these are more often done among individuals that live in zero-vehicle households, more often in lower income households, are also very short trips that happen during the daytime, which is somehow expected. Trips that are replacing for the use of taxi are more likely to be trips that go to and from airports. It's interesting because many times they involve also multiple passengers in the same vehicle, and they tend to be, on average, more mature drivers, which is not surprising because also they are usually higher income household members, and also individuals that travel more for long distance trips, accessing airports and so on. Finally, the individuals that more often report that they would have not made the trip if these services were not available, so the induced demand, we could say, of Uber and Lyft, are more often individuals that live in zero-vehicle households for which these services are really providing more mobility options, and for trips that would have done more often for shopping or social trips, more often without a company. And these are trips that probably on the margin, they were not particularly important in the generation of the schedule, but because of the convenience of having the service, the users could arrange their schedule and their activity patterns in this way, including this new option. So certainly, there's a lot of findings that we're still exploring about in this data set, and the interest is also to understand, how these substitution effects and these impacts on mobility could change if the conditions in which these services are provided or the policy environment changes. Now, Moving forward in the future, we have a lot of interest also to understand more the changes brought by other types of services. I cite micromobility options in particular here because studies so far, and I'm really citing some other authors here to show that these studies have shown that e-scooters somehow, even if they pose sometimes some safety issues, they have similar speeds to bicycles in cities. And so somehow many cities are actually exploring the opportunity that e-scooters could somehow share the bike lane infrastructure. So somehow a growth in e-scooters could be also a way for cities to justify investments in bike lane infrastructure, when in particular they don't have the critical mass of bicyclists yet. This is not the case in Davis, where we have a lot of bicyclists here in Davis, California, but in other parts of the state and the country, really many times cities are struggling with a lagging demand for bicycling that could not justify the investment in bike infrastructure. Well, with these scooters, somehow we would have like the possibility to create this critical mass, and even if the combination of e-scooters and bicycles in bike lane infrastructure sometimes is something that is not really advised by many experts in terms of safety and so on, I would suggest that still it's much better to have e-scooters and bicycles together than e-scooters and huge pickup trucks and heavy-duty trucks in regular car lanes. So somehow we would say that this could be actually a strategy that cities could explore. So a lot of our work right now is really to understand, when we look at all the different type of trips that are happening in cities, when we have more options also, what possibility we have that we could eventually move some trips on the shorter end of the trips, like shorter distances, toward active modes, walking, bicycling, and including also micromobility options, or also shift towards high occupancy modes. And certainly we are exploring a lot now in the current situation that we have in our research, but also it would be very interesting in the future as new mobility options are deployed, but also at the time in which we will have mobility as a service, and so the integration of mobility services in more structured packages of mobility, and potentially the future also with automation. I want to cite a couple of studies we're actually launching right now. One of these is a new nationwide study that we are actually launching right now in fall 2019. And it's a new nationwide study with the data collection deployed in 2019, but also every year for the following 3 years in 8 focus cities in the United States. Because we don't have data yet for this study, I will mainly rely in the second part of my presentation on the following study, which somehow complements this study because it focuses mainly in southern cities. And so we have a sample already that's been collected now in early fall 2019 in Phoenix, Atlanta, Austin, Texas, and Tampa, Florida. And this is a project actually that is developed in cooperation with 4 great schools in Arizona State University, Georgia Tech, UT Austin, and University of South Florida. So I really want to acknowledge the colleagues in these schools that are really helping and giving great support for this study. The reason I'm citing some early findings for this study is because we have some pretty interesting data from micromobility users. And in the next few slides, I will mainly focus on the subsample for Atlanta of this study. As I mentioned, this data collection is still being developed, so we're still collecting data. Right now, we have about 1,000 respondents in Atlanta, but more respondents are still completing the survey in these days as we speak. And we're only a small subsample of users of micromobility so far, only 77 users out of 1,000 respondents, so certainly I could not say this is a representative sample of the users of micromobility. Still, some insights from these early findings I think are useful for discussion today, and I would like to mention them. And so if we look at the 3 purposes, for instance, for which e-scooters are used, we see like, the distribution is very different than other modes. And mainly these services are used for social recreational trips, but also for eating or drinking, and less trips are made for work, school, or shopping errands. Even more interesting is what users would have done if these services were not available, and what is the substitution effect that micromobility is having with other modes. And here, of course, there is some concern because the evidence is really that a large portion of e-scooter trips are actually replacing for trips that could have done by walking or bicycling. And so somehow like this is kind of a concern also in cities, because we are thinking of micromobility as something promoting active transportation, but in reality, we might actually be replacing walking and bicycling. So that's something of a concern. But on the other hand, e-scooters are actually becoming a way to replace also some type of car trips. They are already eroding about 15% in this sample, 15, 16. Again, this is not a representative sample. These are just early results from a small group of users in Atlanta. But this is perfectly consistent with data from Portland, from Sacramento, from other areas that we have been seeing, in which we see some substitution of trips that would have done by Uber or Lyft that are actually shifting to micromobility. And this happens in particular for the lower end of trips made by Uber and Lyft that below the 1.5, 2 miles can be easily replaced by micromobility options. And to some extent also replacement of trips that would have been made by car. And so somehow mixed effects, but also the potential reduction in reducing the use of some vehicles in cities. I want to draw some conclusions here because also we want to leave space for discussion with the participants today and with the discussant Bruce Grittenbeck from SACOG. So our research so far has shown that shared mobility options are getting rapidly adopted in California, and this is consistent with what is happening in other places, in particular in urban areas and big cities. Still, they tend to account for a relatively small portion of the mod share. In general, we see the users tend to be still more young, well-educated urban residents. This is changing a little bit because the adoption is starting to spread also among other groups, but still this remains the big, largest group of users in these areas. The use of these services is often replacing for the use of private vehicles or taxis, but to a certain extent, in particular among certain segments of the population, this is also replacing for the use of public transit at active modes. And I also want to recall the finding that we were discussing before, in which many times we think that pooling is a good option, but we need also to be very careful at the way pooling services, and so Uber Pool and Lyft Share, are deployed in cities, because there is a higher probability that these services might compete with non-car modes in certain urban areas. And this is somehow, I would say, also something that is clearly happening for a combination of reasons. If we think at the price level at which these services are offered, they are cheaper and so more likely to go in direct competition with public transportation. They provide service which is lower level than Uber and Lyft because they take longer waiting time, longer travel time, so they are more likely to appeal to users of public transportation and walking and bicycling, which are more open to take longer travel time and also to not being in a rush to get to the destination. And also they appeal to more price-sensitive customers. And so it makes sense that somehow they can get more in competition with these use of these modes. Certainly in the medium term, there is a big question, which is what the impact of shared mobility will be on car ownership. So in particular, how many users might give up private vehicle ownership because they rely more on shared mobility and these new mobility options. And in our study with the longitudinal analysis of the changes in vehicle ownership, we really want to analyze what are the relationships with the adoption of shared mobility. So far, we have little evidence to show that there is a massive move from people that adopt shared mobility service to give up their private vehicle ownership. But also we need to think that this delayed effect will take quite a bit of time to actually happen in terms of changes in vehicle ownership. So we might not be seeing yet the impact of vehicle ownership, and it will take more time, and we need to study in the next future years. Another big question is also about as mobility as a service, a type of packages will include multiple options of services, also for subscription models and blanket membership that provide access to ride-hailing, micromobility, public transportation, and other services, how this could impact future car ownership. And today, as I was mentioning, only a minority of users seems to be inclined to give up private ownership to switch to these services, but with mass in the future, we might have might see more of this effect happening. We have a couple of new studies that are actually starting right now, one in particular to focus on the willingness to join mass type of mobility packages, and another one focusing particularly on airport access. And we think that, that this actually will bring also big insights about how the use of other services, including car rentals, the use of shuttles to access airports, but also the need for the curbside in terminals and the need for garage parking in the airport terminals will change in the near future. Our work is also dense of policy implications. I will just summarize some here, but I also want to mention that on our website, you can find a lot of information because the PreRevolution Future Mobility Program includes a research, but also policy component, and we provide regularly new policy briefs and documents which are available for download from our website. But certainly, some conclusions here that I would like really to highlight is really that when thinking about the future, in particular in trying to align the deployment of new shared mobility services with the goals of increased sustainability and reduced greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, in California, we need to really think about the human perspective more. And this will be particularly important as we want to deploy this service in combination with other options available in cities. Giving options to travelers is great. At the same time, if we can do that, then in a way that becomes more sustainable, that would be highly desirable from a number of different points of view. Also, of course, the future mobility will certainly depend on the way the market is regulated and priced. If, for instance, we could give incentives and better way to price the use of shared mobility, if these trips are encouraging the use of public transportation, and we can discourage trips that would be in direct competition with public transportation, that could actually bring big impact on society. We also need to think about ways to decarbonize these services. A lot of research developed by our colleagues here at UC Davis showed that TNC drivers' activity is already compatible in most cases with the EV range and performance, and so they could be better off actually driving an EV. Still, the number of EVs in the fleet for TNCs is relatively small, and so we need to think about ways to promote that and incentivize that. And in general, in the future, we need to think about more ways to provide some behavioral nudge really to support shifts towards increased sustainability. Land use and pricing will certainly be key factors to promote more sustainable choices. We also believe that micromobility can really provide support for policies for deploying more bicycling infrastructure. This is already happening in many cities, and we talk many times to planners, and bicycling infrastructure is a tough topic because many times there is not enough support to deploy this infrastructure, in particular when demand is missing. But if we have a more increased demand also thanks for the combination of micromobility and bicycling, they could actually provide more support for this type of infrastructure. And in the future, we should certainly monitor and also think about in the perspective of mass and how this could modify the relationship with private vehicle ownership, which could potentially be much bigger impact than what we see today with the shared mobility options that are available to date. I want to point to a number of references which are available already in published papers, reports, and a number of references available from our website. Also, we have a set of information available on our website at prerev.ucdavis.edu, where you can find more details on all these projects on which I talked today and some of the related publications. And also, if you go in the section of the research program of this website, you can find more information about this and other studies, where you can find all summary of our previous publications, but also links to webinars, presentations from our work. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge the great group of colleagues that have been cooperated on this research, including in particular Farzad Alemi, Young-Sung Lee, Grant Matson, Tol Lee, Jay Milik, and several other people that are really being the core group doing a lot of the work and really developing the data collection and a lot of the analysis presented here. And all the other great colleagues that provided feedback, they helped develop the data collection. They have inspired our work, and I'm sure that I'm not being fair to many other colleagues that help us, but the list will be much longer, including all the other colleagues in other institutions also that help us, and also the great partners in the planning organizations that are really providing a lot of times great feedback and great assistance with our research. With this, I would like to pause here because I think we want to leave time for questions, but I will be very happy to answer any questions from the audience, and I guess first from Bruce.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Giovanni. So this was a very data-rich presentation, so I did just want to reiterate to everyone that the recorded webinar as well as the slides will be available on our website, ncst.ucdavis.edu, hopefully by the end of the week, so check back for those. Giovanni, we did just get a couple terminology clarification questions, so maybe we'll take those on before we go to Bruce. So in one of your early slides, when you're describing that potential apocalyptic future, you use a term called ghost vehicles. Could you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So that slide was referring to the future in which full automation will be already available. And so we're talking about the level 5 automated vehicles that could potentially ride by themselves in cities, even with 0 passengers. So we refer to ghost vehicles as zero occupancy vehicles. This could happen in the future. It's certainly not going to happen massively in society very soon, but with full automation, the level 5 vehicles could happen. It will depend also the way vehicles are regulated. Early findings from the literature show that the repositioning of vehicles between pick-up and drop-off of passengers could actually create a lot of additional miles on our roads. So we could actually have a lot of empty vehicles just relocating around to get new passengers. And in the shared mobility, we have already an analogy today, which is pretty much an empty Uber or Lyft vehicle in which there is only the driver that is relocating with the dead-heading miles to pick up additional passengers. We can imagine how this could become a problem increasingly in the future where we have automated vehicles for either privately owned automated vehicles that are resent to another location to pick up the next passenger, or shared vehicles that will have multiple passengers, but between the drop-off and pick up on the next one will need to relocate in the city.
Thank you. And then could you also just describe the universe of services that fall within shared mobility?
Sure. So the universe of services in the shared mobility is actually changing over time and is getting enriched by new services all the time. In this presentation, I mainly focused and cited 3 types of services. These were car sharing, mainly in the preliminary slides at the beginning. We have quite a bit of information about the use of car sharing in our data set, even if we didn't really focus a lot in this presentation. We focus on ride-hailing services, both in their single user passenger type, the ride-hailing services provided by UberX or Lyft Classic, or the shared pool option of pool services like Uber Pool and Lyft Share. We also talk about micromobility, and so services that provide shared bikes or e-scooters that are usually available today in the dockless services. Of course, there are a lot of also dock-based services, station-based services where users can pick up a bicycle usually. They are not common for scooters, but for bicycles, they're still very common in many cities. And so users need to take the bike and pick it up and return it also at the station. There are also some other type of services that we didn't really focus that much in this presentation today. So in the shared mobility, there is an increased suite of options, microtransit and opportunities for on-demand shuttles and on-demand services with flexible routing and flexible schedules. It's actually becoming increasingly available. So services provided, for instance, by companies like Via and complement public transportation routes in many areas. We have a lot of pilots in California right now going on, and they are a growing area of mobility. And then moving forward in the future, there will be more and more services also because the potential for app-based services is really almost infinite. So we already have today delivery services that are many times, they are focused on freight, delivery of lunches, meals, or packages, but they're really operated by the same drivers that drive for TNCs. So sometimes the same driver will give rides for Uber or for Lyft, and then deliver some Amazon packages, and then deliver some meals for Uber Eats, and they will do other type of services. In other countries, we are seeing an additional growing number of services. In the sub-Indian continent, it's already common to have motorcycle rides. So similar to what we have with Uber today in the or Lyft in the United States, they have also possibility to get a ride with motorcycles or 3-wheelers, and then additional opportunities, for instance, to share seats in the same vehicle. So in Europe, BlaBlaCar is already an option where it's pretty convenient to offer rides where somebody's traveling to a certain destination in exchange for some money. This is not really a professional service like Uber and Lyft usually are in the US, but it's more kind of a sharing the cost of fuel and other costs for a certain trip. And it usually happens more for medium to long distance trips. so intercity trips most of the time. So somehow we have a lot of these services. Of course, some other options I mentioned, BlaBlaCar in Europe. There are similar options also in the US market, and there are also some of these spontaneous type of carpooling that happens through a platform like groups on Facebook or Craigslist and so on. There are a lot of other options, like in particular when we'll have mobility as a service, there will be the possibility also to integrate services for intermodal trips. And so somebody could have a car sharing system integrated in mass packages, having access to ride-hailing and other options. And even car sharing is changing, moving from the station-based in the past, like Zipcar is, to free-floating car sharing like Share Now or Car2Go is right now in the US market, to even peer-to-peer services in which somebody could rent a car through car sharing, a car that belongs to another user. And this is something that in the US is happening with companies like Turo and Get Around, but also in other countries like big groups like Volvo Cars is testing it in China, having like somebody that buys a vehicle, but then the vehicle will be accessible to other users. So I don't want to take more time, but the universe is growing and there are a lot of different types of services.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to bring in our guest respondent. Bruce Griesenbeck is the data analysis manager for the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. And Bruce, we'd love to give you some time to introduce yourself and your organization, and then give us your reactions to the presentation from your practitioner's perspective.
Sure. Can everybody hear me here, or am I coming through at least to you, Leon and Giovanni? Hopefully everybody hears me.
Loud and clear.
Yep, good. So I'll try and be brief because I know there's probably a lot of interest to get to questions from the large and pretty amazing audience for this webinar. But wanted to thank Giovanni and Davis for just doing the continuing at the panel survey approach for this work. I know it takes a lot of effort and it's extremely valuable, most of which I do think in planning there's a temptation to boil everything down to some rules of thumb or anecdotes that we can use to sort of try and navigate through this changing world. And if nothing else, I think Giovanni and Farzad and others at UC Davis are doing a really great job of showing that there's a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity to what's going on, and we have to really invest in data collection and analysis to track it as we go. Thank you for that. I guess by way of introduction, and I'm a huge fan of the looking at different age groupings and different demographic groupings and their responses. I always feel a little bit hesitant about using those just because we tend to start thinking about people as tribes. You know, are you a boomer, are you a Gen X, or are you a Gen Y, or what tribe are you in? And I know that there's a lot more ambiguity to that than there is certainty in terms of what that really means. But it's a handy way of sort of grouping this stuff. I just don't want people to walk away investing too much in those tribal designations. But truth in advertising here, I'm a young boomer. I'm sort of at the tail end of the boomer generation. I'm definitely going through kind of a transition in terms of my own household, with kids leaving the household, and we're making a lot of car owning decisions. And one of the things that you hear a lot from auto manufacturers and others is that they want to get out of the car sales business and into the mobility as a service business. And we're in the process of sort of looking at what our next options are in terms of how many vehicles we own and how we use vehicles. There's really not anything meaningful in the marketplace on that now, and I'm just curious when that's likely to happen, and when it does, do you think it's going to change what I felt like was kind of a very kind of a limited view of what ride-hailing is doing, especially to auto ownership? There's a little bit of positive evidence that it's changing the equation, but not much in the slides that you presented, Giovanni. And number one, I appreciate having the information to look at, but the question for you is just, do you think that having those packages where instead of deciding whether I'm going to buy a vehicle, it's there's a whole spectrum of options. Do you think that's going to change that?
Very good point, Bruce. I will go probably in order with some of the topics that you mentioned. I will start with the generation one. I think it's a very, very good point. I agree with you that absolutely we should not focus too much about the generational differences. We started this project focusing on generations also because, at least at the beginning of the adoption of the shared mobility and the focus in this area, it was perceived more as a trend across the young generations, millennials, and people in urban areas. It is becoming much more than that. And we definitely should not think about these as silos between different groups of users. Cohorts, demographers use cohorts as a conventional way to classify different groups of individuals that many times also related to their stage in life in terms also like their life cycle. But changes are happening transversally across a lot of different generations, a lot of different groups these days. And a lot of our group actually, we are trying actually to look more from even our latent classification approaches. We try to look more about who does a certain behavior, and then we look more about who are these users, what are their household characteristics, what are their individual characteristics, what are their social demographics, and so on. You make also a very good point about car companies and how the industry is reacting to this. Certainly, there's a lot of attention from car companies that are more seeing their future as becoming more mobility providers. And this is definitely something that we discuss many times with many manufacturers. This is a field that is actually a little bit difficult to move on, to operate in, let's say, because we have seen a lot of investment in this area, but also there is not a lot of returns on this investment yet. And this is certainly something that is puzzling a lot of companies as they position themselves as a mobility operator with potentially massive investments in fleets and deployment of services, which so far, not necessarily are profitable. So let's say that car companies, even if they are evolving in their perspective for the future, they still see that right now most of the profits, at least in the US, come from the car market, from selling cars. And certainly, the economic situation, even when we look at the TNCs or micromobility companies, raises a question about what is the path to economic profitability for these companies when operating these services, in particular for the presence of drivers, can be very expensive and not easy actually to bring the budget into the profit area. So certainly, it's a potential, for a big reshaping of the market and the industry. It's still, we need to see when this will become massive, because still today, there's some concerns, we would say, in the industry about, the profitability path from an investment perspective to go into the mobility space. And this is strictly related also to the last topic that you were raising, which is the one of vehicle ownership, because today we are still seeing a large number of vehicles sold every year. And if this changes in the future, definitely this will reshape the market. I think so far we see, I agree with you, we see little evidence that people are giving up their car ownership because of the availability of shared mobility services. There is a percentage of American households that live without a car. And if we look at official statistics, most of these are actually low-income households. They cannot afford a car. The users that decide to live without a car but they could afford one, are really kind of a minority, and it's really kind of a niche market, mainly located in big cities like San Francisco, New York City, Boston, Chicago. A lot of the others are really people that live without a car by necessity. Now, not necessarily focusing on the zero vehicle owning households, there is the car light behavior that could be actually an option in the future. So a household could just simply reduce the number of vehicles they have in the household without going zero vehicle. And that certainly is something that I think is more likely to happen in a higher percentage. So we could have more households that could move, for example, from owning 2 vehicles to only 1 if cities provide more options to travel in other modes, which is not only shared mobility. And I'm touching this topic in particular because I think land use is very important. if we have coordination of development of cities with availability of more options, that certainly could lead more users to live with fewer vehicles in the household. Many residential neighbors these days are really car dependent, and even going to grocery store or to the many places where individuals need to travel, it's something that needs to happen with a car. For this type of households, even providing a lot of new options for mobility services might still leave more reliance on cars. And of course, the higher reliance on e-shopping, for instance, even for grocery shopping these days, could change this equation. But I think really that the combination of the land use planning, the organization of services in cities, and the availability of the new mobility options would be really key to see if in the future we will have changes in the way households adjust their vehicle ownership.
And I had one more kind of question or comment, and then I see questions piling up in the Q&A. I want to be able to get to those, allow you to get to those. But I guess it starts with a methodological question and ends, I hope, with is either a suggestion or a substantive question. On slide 15, you sort of described the panel approach that was used for the survey that you're reporting out on. And obviously one real unique thing about it is just the true panel part of it, where you're revisiting the same respondents over time. I'm curious what percentage of the overall sample falls into that category of having multiple instances of responding to the survey over time, and what percentage are truly first timers?
Unfortunately, the percentage of the panel is not very high. And this is actually something that we are trying to work on, so we hope to increase it substantially for future data collections.
Right, and part of the reason, I go there is and this is the substantive part of the question. I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want to make sure we get to the questions. And there was a suggestion here that I think might be of interest to the rest of the group here. There's a series of slides, 25, 26, 27, that talks about the substitution for individual trips. But I'm a planner who really does feel like the longer term impact of alternative modes, micromobility, sharing rides, ride hailing is not going to be just, what did I do for this instant trip? It's going to be the longer that you have access to those services, your pattern of travel and your pattern of activities changes in ways that are hopefully positive. And I'm curious if that's a thread of research that you intend to do as the survey proceeds. I'm really interested if somebody's been you've been a regular ride-hailing user for a longer time period, over for a 2 or 3 or a 4 year period. Are they starting to adapt their lifestyle around the presence of that mode? And the same with bike share, the same with scooters. I'm just curious if if there's either any published research that looks at that effect over time, or if that's an intent for the later stages of research on this. And that's the last question I'll ask. I definitely want to give the chance for all the Q&A stuff that's piling up.
Yeah, I love all your questions, Bruce. So thank you so much for that. You raised some very, very important topics. I agree with you. What we need to investigate more is definitely the changes on the mobility patterns and the organization of activity and travel patterns of different type of users as they adjust to the new reality with ride-hailing, with shared mobility, with micromobility, etc. I think this research is providing some insights in this. We are definitely looking more into these are just some preliminary findings, but we're looking more into the mobility patterns of the users, the type of a relationship they have with the overall use of all different modes of transportation. I think there was a question also from somebody in the audience that was asking, we reported information about the use of shared mobility, but what about the use of walking, bicycling, public transportation, private cars? Absolutely, we have all that information. We didn't have the time to focus on it today during this presentation. We want to definitely dedicate much more interest in that. And we have been doing already some studies. So I think on our website, we have One paper that was recently published at the beginning of 2019. Yongsung Lee is the first author on that looks into like multimodality patterns in our data set and looking at different type of users and the way they use shared mobility, but also driving, carpooling, using public transportation, etc. Not only for the last trip, but for their entire set of trips they do for commuting purposes, for non-commuting purposes, and their general travel patterns. I also want to mention that definitely I see the combination of this study with other potential studies. We do not have a full travel diary as part of this survey. This survey was more kind of an exploratory research for research purposes, but we do not collect for reasons of budget of the research and also like, research design. We don't have a full GPS tracking travel diary as, for instance, SECOG has done in the most recent regional household travel survey. And this is actually one of the reasons for which we believe that the combination of approaches like this one done in this project with approaches like the analysis of data collected in your recent regional household travel survey and the cooperation we already started with SECOG, but also other data sets and other type of data sets available from other sources would be very important. I also want to mention that we are discussing with a number of agencies about the way to build on this type of research to really customize it to draw important planning conclusions. This is something that we are doing pretty much on a daily basis. So right now we are having intense conversation with the California Resources Board, for instance. They are very interested in understanding how the conclusions from this study and eventual other study could inform policy making and new regulations. And we're actually thinking that probably a new data collection that is specifically targeted for answering those questions, that includes also a GPS tracking with a full trip diary, would be actually useful for answering more complex questions about how the mobility patterns and the full activity and travel patterns for individuals are changing. So I think while at the same time, I think we are doing answering some interesting questions with this research, I also see like, the number of activities that we need to do in the near future growing even more. And I talk not only for myself, but all the entire research team here at UC Davis and all the other colleagues working in the transportation research community.
Great. So we do have a number of questions coming in from the audience. We've already, I think, addressed a couple of them. We did get a question asking to what degree you've done any statistical modeling to understand the behavior that's influencing micromobility services usage.
We're working on it. So for the micromobility usage, we are working on it. As I mentioned, a lot of the data we are collecting on micromobility are very recent, from 2019 right now. And so we are still collecting the data. Definitely the next stage will be to do statistical analysis on that, in particular with the relational models to explain which variables are really affecting the use of these services, being them land use features, geographic location, or individual characteristics or trip characteristics. So definitely something that will come soon, so please stay tuned on that.
Great. We got a question asking about, so the data you presented showed that scooter usage is replacing a fair number of walking trips. The question is, do you think that might change as people become more accustomed to the presence of those scooter options and start maybe riding further to sort of potentially replace more car trips? So as the service becomes more mature, that maybe we would see a different distribution in the types of trips being displaced.
Sure. What we are seeing, is only the early phenomenon in this area, and I think much more will come. One thing that these scooters and micromobility are already causing is they are broadening the market for bicycling. Market for bicycling, for instance, that is becoming more and more popular now in many areas, even in places where there was no traditional bicycling. For example, for trips going out at night, in the evening. A lot of trips that usually were not done by bicycling, in particular in big cities. There is totally space that getting occupied now by e-scooters and micromobility options. And there's actually potential impact on a lot of trips that could have been done by cars, but also the use of Uber and Lyft. Now, we need also to be careful about the potential safety issues that this could entail, in particular if micromobility trips happen at night after people have drank. So maybe like using an Uber to go home would be better recommended after somebody comes back from the bars rather than using these scooters. But certainly this is something that is changing, and I think the more these services are adopted, the more we might see actually changes happening on the use also of private cars or shared cars with TNCs. A lot will depend also on cities, because cities are actually starting to enforce very strict regulations, and this could either restrict the use of micromobility or even promote it. Restricted, for instance, because some cities are really restricting the places where e-scooters can be used. They are putting regulations about not operating them on the sidewalks for safety reasons, not operating at a certain time of the day, in the evening, for instance, in some places. Also, it could promote micromobility, for instance, if we have more restrictions to parking. Free parking is actually one of the big attractors to using a car in American cities. The more there are restrictions on parking and lower availability of parking, the more actually that could induce the changes where the modes shift towards other modes, including shared mobility options.
Great, thanks. So that's actually a good segue to another question we got that I think is maybe a little outside the focus of this research, but I think would be of interest to a lot of folks on the phone. And so maybe if you don't have the answer, you might have some resources. But the question is how safety of micromobility is being assessed. Whereas unlike motor vehicle crashes where you have a more systematic recordation and analysis of those types of crashes, if there's no motor vehicle involved, is there any work being done that you're aware of on safety of micromobility options and how that might be being tracked?
You're correct. I'm not a safety expert, so I would definitely refer to my colleagues working in the field. There's been several reports and several exploratory studies that look at safety. Certainly, the attention on safety and micromobility has increased a lot since we started to get the first casualties and people unfortunately dying on e-scooter. And a lot of times the safety is associated to a couple of factors. One of these is the interaction with motor vehicles, especially interaction with cars, with larger vehicles, trucks, either light-duty trucks or even like big heavy-duty trucks, garbage trucks, delivery trucks, and so on. But also there's another factor, that is e-scooters are bringing users that traditionally didn't have a habit of bicycling on a micromobility option. And sometimes this might lead to unsafe behaviors, overestimating their safety and their ability to get out of situations, overestimating the braking ability of scooters on going downhill, which are actually a big issue in many areas, especially in cities with big hills. The structure of the scooter is also changing. Several companies are switching to scooters models with slightly bigger wheels, which are more stable and also less subject to potholes, because that can be a big problem actually causing people to fall, and especially if mixed traffic that could expose actually to a lot of risk. So certainly I would say there is studies that are looking into that, not what we are doing, but other colleagues in the field, they're doing it. And there is also reactions from the industries, from the cities, to try to separate the flows from cars, industry moving to bigger wheels, more visible colors, better light, better ability to recognize the scooter, better brakes, and so like an ability also to get a better safety on the systems. Now, of course, there's another topic that is the lack of helmet. There's a big issue associated with using micromobility options. It's a problem that is difficult to solve because for all shared modes, it's difficult to imagine somebody leaving their home carrying a helmet because they think at some point during the day they might rent a bike, they might rent a scooter. This is very different from people that leave their home with their own privately owned bicycle or scooter, in which they already can carry the helmet, and even enforcing a mandatory use of a helmet could be more easily done for privately owned type of scooters or bicycles, rather than the shared option that is we cannot really imagine people sharing a helmet. and at the same time, it's difficult to imagine the people that we can enforce that they will leave their home, everybody carrying a helmet just because at some point they might use a scooter or a bicycle. But that's certainly, in terms of passive forms of safety to reduce the severity of the potential accident, is a big issue.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So Bruce, we actually have a question for you if you're still with us and you're open to that. The question is about how you might envision SACOG incorporating some of these findings into some of the work that your agency is doing, or how it might influence some of SACOG's decision making.
Yeah, happy to give a brief answer to that. Yeah, we've been tracking this research, and we're really interested in some of the I guess I'd put it in the category shorter term questions, which is what impact are these ride-hailing micromobility having on transit, bike, and walk. And we're watching with I guess some level of concern at this point about the evidence that's rolling in on that. So we're trying to use that to make judgments about sort of what we're trying to get out of those services. We definitely are interested in those, what I mentioned earlier in my comments, which is just the longer term and more activity pattern effects of ride-hailing micromobility, all the new modes that are coming online. In more sort of, does the continued presence of these services make changes in how people organize their lives and travel, and the substitution questions just don't really allow you to address that in any meaningful way. So we're really hopeful that both the longitudinal aspect of this and then the sort of reflective, how long have you been using these modes, could help us to sort of figure out if that's happening and to what extent that's happening. But yeah, it's such an early stage of data collection on what the impact of these services are. We definitely are trying to learn and adapt our policies to it. So yeah, that's probably not a satisfying answer, but it's as good as an answer as I can give at this point.
Thanks, Bruce. That's helpful. So we've got time for hopefully a couple more questions. Thanks to everyone who's submitted questions. They're really, really thoughtful. So the next question is, Giovanni, to what degree do you think that transit frequency, transit transfer barriers, land use density, some of those issues have contributed to that kind of bottom tier of shared mobility users, the ones that are lower income in suburban areas, where those trips are replacing, I guess that tier, those trips are tending to replace car trips, or replacing transit trips.
It's an excellent question. Certainly it affects us a lot. It affects us a lot because nowadays we are in a situation in which public transit in many areas is not very efficient and not providing a very convenient service. And so it's not surprising that in certain situations, ride-hailing is actually substituting for the use of transit. And I would say it's not really like something we should get mad at the ride-hailing providers, but probably we should think about what we can do in planning to improve the system, so in an holistic way we can provide better quality of service for the users. And the reality is that in many places in California where these data were collected, the transit services are not very good. Apart from some main corridors where the high quality of transit is provided with frequent service, in particular with rail, and we see that the competition with rail is actually much better because rail systems tend to be, especially subway systems, tend to be high quality systems that provide a frequent service, a reliable service, and is more resistant to the competition with ride-hailing services. The reality, especially for bus services, the many routes that are deployed, many times they have a very long travel times because of the need to cover a lot of different neighbors with just a single bus, many times with very poor headways and not very good frequent service. So this certainly affects the use of the public transportation system, but also the interaction between public transportation and ride-hailing. Now, this is in the current situation today. As I mentioned during my presentation, certainly there are lots of policy implications, and there is a lot of work that is already underway in trying to improve the combination between ride-hailing and the coordination between ride-hailing and public transportation. And this is something that's happening for a lot of pilots already, coordination between companies like Uber and Lyft working with the public transportation agency. It's something that's happening with microtransit solution, with companies like Via and other pilots that have been deployed, for instance, to provide service which are more customized for the users, with on-demand service, with service that could actually provide a feeding effect to big transportation hubs in particular. And this is in particular important for feeding lines. So the low quality public transportation lines that many times are running with a low frequency, with travel times which are not very good, many times with the lack of the proper right of way, so with mixed flow with car vehicles. And those are the conditions in which transit is actually more weak, and it's more subject to the potential competition on new modes. A lot of companies now are thinking about the future of transit could be actually reshaped in focusing the investments and the efforts and the service in providing high quality corridors where the service is more frequent and better quality, and then maybe the feeding could be done with smaller vehicles, maybe on-demand services, not necessarily operated by TNCs. It can be actually operated also by third parties or operated directly by the company, even if this might entail higher cost of production of the service, but somehow reshaping and harvesting the benefits of the new technology rather than just suffering the consequences. And this is certainly something that many transit agencies are thinking about, and even in meetings like APTA meetings or the UITP, the International Union of Public Transportation Operators, it's a topic for big discussion.
Great, okay. So I think we have time for one more question. You had shown a figure earlier comparing 2015 to 2018 changes in ride-hailing frequency, and there's a category that was has used ride-hailing in the past, but not anymore. And the data showed that that category of people had dropped pretty significantly, or had risen pretty significantly from 2015 to 2018. Why do you think that is?
Well, one of these is a physiological reason. In 2015, already these services were pretty new, and there was a low likelihood, they were not very heavily used, and so there was low likelihood that somebody has already used them in the past and not using them anymore. Now, this service has been around for a little bit more time. There is the possibility that somebody has tried them, they use them, they don't really use them anymore. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like the service, but somebody can do just something because they were visiting a relative or they were with some friends. It happened to them to use it once, and then they haven't done it anymore. So they cannot say I never use it because somehow they use it, but for some reason it's not part of their mobility patterns today. So I would really focus, interpret that in terms like, these are users that somehow are familiar with what these services provide, but these services don't match their current mobility needs, and so they're not part of their space of transportation options that they use. I would also mention another thing, that many times when we look at these users, we need to think that a lot of times we're really talking, and a lot of the discussion about the substitution with other modes, we're really talking about that subset of users which are largely multimodal. So if you look at the distribution of trips in the US and the trip patterns, a lot of users really rely a lot on a car, and a large majority of trips are made by car in the US society. And there is a subgroup of users which are more multimodal. Sometimes they use cars, sometimes they use public transportation, they also use a bike or walk, or they take ride-hailing and so on. Shared mobility options seems to appeal mainly to these multimodal users, and at least in the early stages in these first few years, they started to create more market among these users. The big question would be if this service can become really as a massively adopted user, massively adopted service that can become popular also among the other groups, in particular those that drive all the time And would this be a way to convince somebody who is pretty much using a car for all their trips to eventually start becoming more multimodal? If this happens, actually, that could be actually a great thing for society, because it could start actually eroding the market of the single occupant vehicle that today our statistics say is still the vast majority of trips.
Right. Great. Well, we're at our time, so we don't have time for any more questions. Giovanni, I really want to thank you for the great presentation. And Bruce, thank you very much for joining us and offering your perspective. And certainly thanks to everyone who joined us on the webinar. Thanks for all your great questions. And apologize, we couldn't get to quite all of them. But please do check your email. We'll be sending out a follow-up survey. We'd love to get your feedback on what we could do better for the next time. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this is a monthly webinar series. We've got our next one scheduled for November 6th, and we'll be hearing about gentrification and displacement around new transit stations in the Los Angeles area. So would certainly welcome you to join us for that one as well. And with that, we'll be signing off and wishing you a good rest of your day. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.